Kawalik, I'm Frank Blanket. Welcome to FNX Now. This segment takes a look at the challenges facing traditionally undercounted communities, including Native American and Indigenous populations. Here is Pilar Maguero for more.
Good morning, everyone. We're just going to go right in with our first guest, Arturo Vargas. He's Executive Director of the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, NALEO. Arturo, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Pilar, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody. And Sandy, thank you for the opportunity to join you here today to talk a little bit about how we're doing and trying to complete the 2020 census amid some extraordinary circumstances that none of us anticipated. As you all know, we all knew that this will be one of the most challenging enumerations that the Census Bureau would have to undertake in 2020 for a number of reasons and situations that you've already covered. The COVID-19 pandemic simply has made that challenge much more difficult for the Census Bureau. Adding to that, political interference by the administration has also further complicated the work of the Census Bureau career professionals. So what I'd like to do is to cover a little bit about what we've some developments from this week, and then some other issues that I think are important for you all to follow and things to look for as the Census Bureau undertakes the non-response follow-up operation in a couple of weeks. First, the policy memo that the Trump administration or the president himself released on Tuesday. One thing to make clear is that the president is not asking for undocumented immigrants not to be counted in the census. And we're very concerned there has been coverage and a great deal of media suggesting that immigrants are not to be counted. That is not what the policy memo is asking for. The policy memo is asking for the Secretary of Commerce, after the census is itself completed, to somehow remove from the counts of every state a certain number of persons believed to be undocumented immigrants. And the only way to do that would be to use some sort of estimates or sampling of populations in order to determine how many persons in each state is an undocumented immigrant. This is extremely imprecise. And as we said in our statement that we released on Tuesday, this amounts to nothing more than cooking the numbers, of making up an entire new data set on which to base the most important element of our democracy, and that's the reapportionment of representation in the House of Representatives. What I believe is also an assault on the American sensibility is that the president pretends to be able to amend the Constitution by memo. Nothing could be more offensive if it weren't so ridiculous. But the impact it has had already, I think, is significant. In the way it has been reported by too many outlets that this is, in fact, the president asking for immigrants to be excluded from the actual count. And we already know that we are lagging in response rates in heavy Latino areas around the country. On June 17th, we conducted a town hall where we released data that was a deep dive into the response rates that the Census Bureau releases on a daily basis. And while the Census Bureau crows about reaching its goal of 60.1% of response rates sometime in June, remember that goal was supposed to have been reached on April 31st. And even if now we're close to 63% of households having self-responded, that still means 37% of America's households have yet to respond to the census. And the only way they will be counted is if they answer the knock on the door through non-response follow-up. That's an operation that's supposed to begin on August 11th. There are a couple things we need to look for to see how successful this will be. One is, to the extent that the Census Bureau will be able to deploy satisfactory workforce that is both in numbers and in cultural competence to be able to go into the diverse neighborhoods where the response rates are the lowest, to be able to knock on doors, and to do so in a way that is safe given local public health protocols that are requiring, of course, social distancing, use of personal protective equipment, and the like. We know that the Census Bureau has purchased millions of pieces of personal protective equipment for their enumerators to use. But we also know that they're experiencing some challenges in the enumerators actually feeling fully comfortable in going door to door and trying to get responses from these households that have yet to fill out their forms. This will be especially challenging, not just in single family dwellings, but when enumerators have to go into, say, apartment buildings, where that kind of social distancing is simply practically impossible. And to the extent that enumerators will be able to get the information that's needed to complete the count. This is particularly concerning for NALEO, Educational Fund, because we know that the only way we're going to get to close to 100% of a Latino enumeration is if non-response follow-up is successful. The last thing I will raise here is that the Census Bureau, about 2 months ago, indicated it needed more time to complete the enumeration in order to report the apportionment counts and the redistricting data. And they requested the administration to request an extension of the deadlines that can only be done by Congress. And so the administration actually formally requested an extension of the deadline from December 31st to the end of March for the apportionment counts, and from April 1 to July 1 for the redistricting data to be reported to the states. We now understand that it is likely the administration will no longer be making that request, that it is going to force the Census Bureau to try to finish this job under the current circumstances, under the current deadlines. Just about 2 weeks ago, the Associate Director of the Census Bureau, Al Fontenot, had said that it already was too late for the Census Bureau to meet the current deadlines. They were beyond that already. So the thing is to keep a close eye on the political interference by the Census Bureau and second guessing the professionals and the scientists and the demographers at the Census Bureau who are trying to finish this job under extraordinary circumstances.
Thank you so much, Arturo. We do have one question from Sunita.
Hi, could you elaborate as to how the Commerce Department would determine the number of undocumented immigrants? You said it was an imprecise methodology, but could you elaborate on that? And then to follow up, are you concerned that this is essentially going to amount to gerrymandering congressional districts?
First, in terms of how will the census of the Department of Commerce arrive at a number of undocumented immigrants? It would simply be by making estimates. There is, not only is there no question on the decennial census on citizenship, there is also no question on immigration status. There is no way to determine the exact number of individuals who are undocumented, and even to determine what constitutes undocumented status in itself often requires an expert lawyer to understand the different definitions of status in this country. You know, would this include, for example, a DACA recipient? Would it include somebody who's seeking asylum and has not yet received residency in this country? Who determines who's undocumented and not? And so these data would somehow need to be applied to each state. Now, will it result in gerrymandering? What it will result in is a malapportionment of the House of Representatives. And it will be done in complete violation of the Constitution. The language of the Constitution says to apportion the House of Representatives based on the whole number of persons. And that whole number has to come from the census. And now the administration wants to play with the numbers after the census to come up with a new figure on which to reapportion the House.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on to Young C. Jan. He's President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and he can go in deeper into the legal side of things.
Thank you very much. First off, I would like to thank Ethnic Media Services for inviting me to be part of this call and to talk about these important issues. And all of you that are on this call have been such critical partners to what we have doing, particularly around the census. And we know that you have worked tirelessly to ensure that all of our communities are counted accurately in this decennial census. Advancing Justice AJC has been proud to be a member of a number of different organizations, including, along with Arturo, as co-chair of the Census Task Force for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and also to be on the National Advisory Committee for the Census Bureau's Committee on Race, Ethnicities, and Other Populations. So in talking about this issue, first and foremost, let me be clear. The goal has not changed. The goal is to make sure that all of our communities are fairly and accurately counted. That goal has not changed because of this July 21 presidential memorandum. And our charge to our community, our charge to our population remains the same, that they should respond to the census regardless of immigration status. As Arturo said, there is no immigration status question whatsoever on the census. And we would encourage people to respond either by telephone, online, or if they have the paper form, to respond by paper. If you do that, then depending on when the Census Bureau might send the door knockers or enumerators, they might not come to your door because you have already responded to the census. So let me talk about the July 21 presidential memorandum. As Arturo said, the memorandum has nothing to do with our current 2020 census that is taking place. And so that should not be a reason for people not to respond. What the memorandum does do is suggest that undocumented communities will not count for purposes of dividing up congressional representation, apportionment, if you will, between the states. Let me say this, that is patently unconstitutional. Arturo talked about the language of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution makes clear that apportionment is based on all persons in the United States. The Constitution and other places makes clear that it understands the difference between citizens and persons. And the suggestion that somehow undocumented immigrants are not people or not persons just flies in the face of logic, flies in the face of Supreme Court precedent, and flies in the face of legislative history and policy of the United States for several hundred years. Look, we are all counted. The census counts every person living in the country, regardless of whether they are citizens and regardless of their immigration status. And so that's one thing that we need to be clear about. Arturo mentioned litigation. It is clear that there are groups that are going to litigate this matter. My group litigated initially the citizenship question in the 2020 census when the Commerce Department tried to impose that. As you all know, a number of organizations did, and we won. We are looking at the same thing here. We already have litigation against the Census Bureau on a different aspect of the Census Bureau policy with respect to how they are looking at citizenship data. We are certainly looking at including in litigation this presidential memorandum. Clearly, this presidential memorandum is unconstitutional, and we need to make sure that it stays such. The memorandum at bottom seeks to shift that political representation away from places that have large immigrant communities by defining the census's constitutional mandate to ensure that each state is represented in proportion to total population. Again, it's total population and not citizenship. So my last words goes back to where I started, which is that non-response follow-up operations are going to begin shortly. In certain places, they have already begun. So it is imperative for our communities to rise above the fear tactics that are being used, rise above the misinformation that is being used, and to participate in the census. And I would encourage all of you to please make sure to report this in the right manner, that this presidential memorandum does not affect the current census operation, but it is about, as Arturo has suggested, cooking the books after the fact to come to a result that benefits a certain political class of individuals. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next speaker out there in Hidalgo County, Texas, Nestor Lopez. Please go ahead and let us know what's going on down there.
We have been facing an uphill battle, unfortunately, on a couple of different fronts. First of all, we have been undercounted the last 2 decades, and that in and of itself is problematic because we try to figure out why that happened, how to avoid that. And another one of the big challenges that we have faced is the fact that this census has been primarily promoted to be a self-response online. A lot of the parts in our county simply do not have internet connectivity. So that has really caused us to shift messaging and gears towards a more of an in-person interaction, which really brings me to the development of COVID-19. That has really thrown a wrench into our operations because that's really stopped us from doing a lot of our in-person outreach that would help us reach these key demographics that have historically been undercounted. Throughout the last few months, we've all been kind of on hold, hoping that this would clear up or ease up a little bit. But unfortunately, our county specifically has become one of the hotspots for COVID-19 in the entire country. So really that has shifted a lot of attention towards that. We are facing, like it has been mentioned by different leaders here, a sense of census fatigue also. And again, these are all uphill battles that we are trying to overcome. And this week with the announcement of the administration's actions, that's simply another hurdle that we have to overcome. We are a very large, the majority of Hidalgo County is minority. We have a demographic of undocumented residents here, people residing here. So this really is going to be a very big challenge. Like it was mentioned by Mr. Arturo Vargas, this is a very complex issue that can very easily be mistaken. The details of it can be mistaken, and it's very hard to truly digest and get to the core of what is being instituted by the administration. And unfortunately, what we have seen, like we saw with the citizenship question, is simply the results of the messaging affecting our community. So how I like to approach it is we can look at potential effects and real life effects if this is to stand. And the real life effects are going to be extremely detrimental to us simply because we are a large community with undocumented immigrants here. Our political representation would suffer, and being one of the poorer areas of the entire country, I'm sure this would bleed into the federal funding side of it. But really, even the potential effects, even if this doesn't uphold, the messaging side of this has been so damaging in our area because people simply don't have the time, they don't have the ability to dive into the weeds of what is actually going on, and they're just entirely taken back and dissuaded from actually participating in the census. Months after the citizenship question has been taken down by the Supreme Court, we're still facing the effects of the citizenship question here. We're facing every day, we interact with people who ask, oh, I heard they're asking for citizenship information, which is simply not true. So affects actions like the ones taken this week by the administration, that in and of itself, whether it stands, whether it doesn't stand, in and of itself is going to be very, very damaging for our region and the future of our region. So really, what is it that we can do here? And while we are very unique here, I think this really does. Our challenges are shared by other border communities too, and really what we're shifting towards is some of the things that have been mentioned already by Mr. Vargas and Mr. Yang, that the Constitution mandates that everybody is counted. It's not just the Constitution mandating that just residents, that just citizens. It's everybody. And by showing that, by pushing on that message and highlighting the importance of it, what is at stake here? What is going to be effective if you're not counted? And really, we have one of the best examples going on in our county, the COVID-19 situation. If you are not counted, events like what we're going through right now are going to be much worse. Things like education, things like infrastructure. And really, that's all we can do at the moment is really just push this message of the importance and continue our outreach. We have shifted a lot of our outreach due to the COVID-19 development to virtual outreach. And like Ms. Stevens has said they've done in their area, we've reached into and tapped into a lot of the local voices, a lot of the local trusted partners, not just government officials, not just nonprofit organizations, but a lot of the local celebrities to say, and really to get them to share our message, because as it was mentioned, the state did not allocate any resources toward this. So this has really landed on a lot on our plate to try to promote it. And we have found that has been successful. We're reaching to these people, to our schools, or essentially the trusted voices of the community to spread this message and push the importance of it.
We have a really good question here from Frank Blanquette.
Sure, go ahead.
We try to reach out to the Latinx community that identifies with their indigenous background more so than their nationality. So Zapotec rather than Mexican, Maya rather than El Salvadorian, etc. What message do you have to those communities, undocumented or not, and the importance to properly identify themselves in the census?
Sure. So, at least in our area, a lot of these demographics have been historically undercounted because of things like what's going on right now, because of unclear messaging of who should be counted, who shouldn't be counted, and really this is something that we try to push, is that our area, our county, our region is one of the fastest growing regions in Texas, and our county and our region is being shaped by these growing populations. So what we really try to share is, you need to be counted so that the state represents the people who are living in it, and by pushing that message of who they identify with, if that's who they want the state to represent, they really need to be counted. And this is, of course, independent of all of the financial and political implications of it. But that's really the message that we're trying to get across, that if we want the state to look as it really is, you need to be counted for in the census.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our last guest and then take the questions that are left in the chat. Kayla Olvera Hilario, she's a tribal affairs specialist for the California Complete Count Census 2020. Kayla, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm here representing the state of California and the tribes. I'm the only one working with tribes across the state. We have two great partners, the California Indian Manpower Consortium and the California Native Vote Project, who are doing tons of work virtually and have boots on the ground and are just doing amazing work in this pivot that we've had to make for COVID-19. And so the state's invested about $2 million to the tribes and to make sure that the tribes are counted. So some of the reasons why this is especially important to tribes are for sovereignty. So tribes have sovereign government-to-government relationships with the United States, and this has allowed tribes to declare a state of emergency and not allow any of the enumeration and to decide how they want that process to take place with update leave, with NARFU. We also have tribal partnership specialists from the U.S. Census Bureau that are working on a case-by-case basis with tribes to see how that will take place, what PPE will be needed, and how all of those operations, if they needed a security guard to walk through the reservation. And so because these are government-to-government relationships, it's been a very unique and challenging process for tribes, where a lot of the update leave process started early on. Tribes were closed due to the COVID pandemic. And so they're really starting update leave really late. And based on their, again, case-by-case relationship with the U.S. Census Bureau. So while everybody else was responding to the census without a unique ID, whether or not update leave had happened yet, tribes were instructed to wait for the unique identifier. And so update leave would identify the household, the location, and leave a packet with the unique identifier, and then tribal households could respond to the census. Now, some of those tribes still to this day have not received those unique identifiers, which is causing a huge challenge, of course, because they're not being able to match those addresses with the household that is responding. One issue that we're working with the U.S. Census Bureau is that if tribes remain closed, how will we get them counted? And so we have NARFU that's coming up, and the U.S. Census Bureau is making a big push to hire someone within the tribe that lives on the reservation that can go and knock on doors and complete the NARFU process. And so that's kind of the push. They gave us until about August 17th to get people trained, hired, background checked, and out there to be knocking on doors of tribes. And so this is a big challenge for us. Our numbers are pretty low across the state. There are 110 tribes that are federally recognized. About 59 of those fall under the operations of the U.S. Census Bureau. And there's a handful that, like I said, have not received their packets yet. So of those tribes, the numbers are kind of scattered. We have some tribes at 60% response rate, and a lot of tribes are like hovering around 20 to 30% response rate, and about 20 tribes that are like under 15% response rate. The positive thing is that our response rates are greater than they were in 2010. So all the work that the partners are doing, they're being very innovative, having drive-through movie nights, all types of different activities that are very innovative for people. So I think those efforts are working. We're doing better than we did in 2010, and we'll keep striving for a complete count.
Frank has a question for Kayla from Lanquette.
Hi, Keila. How do you address the inherent distrust that tribes have in the federal government that's been building for generations? And since I asked Nestor, what can you tell us about the Chicano or Latinx population that identifies as Native American? What message can you give to them as well?
Yeah, so the people that identify as Native American and as Hispanic, they can put both races and they will be counted as both. They'll be counted as Native American and as Hispanic. And then as far as the distrust for the government, that is a huge barrier, especially with this administration. We also have immigrants that are living on reservation, and some tribes are kind of slowing down, like, let's figure out what's going on with this memo before we continue on with the activities that we had planned. And we are just counting on our trusted messengers. Like I said, the 2 statewide organizations, all of the tribes got a little bit of funding. And so if folks hear that message from someone they trust in their tribal leadership, then hopefully they'll respond. But it's definitely a huge challenge that we're trying to address.
Thank you so much. And before we close out, I would like to ask the most important thing you want to communicate to people right now.
My message would just be for tribal communities to get counted. This is an act of sovereignty. We hold the government accountable to the treaty responsibilities they promised to us for health, education, and housing. Through completing the census, this is our pathway to the resources that we need for our communities.
Thank you so much to all our guests and journalists. Thanks, everyone.
Dios Votig. Thank you, Pilar. For FNX Now, I am Frank Blanquette.